Now, Dr. Daniel Hoskins and his family spent 12 years in Central Asia as church planters among unreached Muslim people groups. And today he's a researcher, trainer, and writer focused on church planting in pioneer mission contexts. He also loves to help others develop robust mission research and analysis. Dr. Hoskins holds a doctorate in religious studies from the University of South Africa, and he's here today to share with us about common approaches to mixed methods research projects. Daniel?
Thank you, Dan. Let me see if I can do my screen share here without any complications. So my presentation today is common approaches to mixed methods research. I started mission research about 25 years ago doing ethnographic field studies as part of the church planting that we were doing among Muslims in Central Asia. And to tag onto something that Dan said at the beginning, I was very, very fortunate in those days to have, in my early days, to have some top quality ethnographers and researchers from other fields that began to mentor me when they saw that I was, in fact, one of them, one of my good friends, Bill Clark, said, Dan, I think you're trying to do ethnography, but you don't know what you're doing. And they mentored me and began to help me understand the field and got me into some programs. And eventually I did a master's degree. But the bottom line was I had some incredible mentors as part of my early research experience. And I have had mentors and colleagues that have input all down through the line. And I want to say how important that is. And if you're in your earlier years of entering research, seek out people that are farther along for their input, because I know it's greatly enriched my own journey in research. So I just want to tag, that was a great comment earlier, Dan. So as I said, when I entered mission research 25 years ago, and at that time there was a bit of debate going on in the mission world about which was better, to do quantitative research or to do qualitative research. And sometimes I encountered people who could make really strong arguments for one side or the other. In fact, at times it became almost a debate. Of course, as a field ethnographer at the time, I would always side with team qualitative because that's where my heart is. And that still to this day, I prefer qualitative research over quantitative. It's just the way my mind works. Numbers, I count well with my fingers. And then after that, it gets a little complicated for me. But qualitative is it's much more intuitive, and that's what I do. But thankfully, that era of debating between the two is behind us, because now we've come to the understanding that each qualitative and quantitative approaches have their own place in mission research. Whereas qualitative research answers certain kinds of questions better, quantitative is far superior for other kinds of questions, other ideas that we need to find out, other things knowledge we need to generate. They're both important for us as we attempt to have better understandings of how to go about fulfilling the Great Commission. So at the risk of oversimplifying, I want to put it this way. Qualitative, you might say, is best at exploring new ideas, at exploring concepts or a population of people that we really don't know much about. Interviews with them is a way of exploring these open ideas and thoughts, gaining their stories and gaining the insights that people have from their stories. The less we know about something at the beginning, the better suited it is for a qualitative research approach. Now, on the other hand, quantitative research is better at capturing the big picture. It's great at testing theories we have. We already have an idea about something, so we test it with surveys. Or, of course, it's effective for counting peoples or churches or numbers of baptisms or things of that nature. So each one of them approach research questions differently. Now, this would be a good point for me to admit something that's maybe a little embarrassing, but as I said, I have a non-traditional research educational background. I did most of my graduate work after I'd already been in the field for a long time. And so a lot of what I learned about research, I learned in the field on the fly, so to speak. So when I started doing mission research, I had a hard time keeping these two terms, qualitative and quantitative, apart. And people would be throwing these terms around all the time, and I had a hard time remembering which was which. So eventually developed a little mnemonic that I used. Qualitative is about qual. It's about the qualities of something or describing a thing. On the other hand, quantitative is about the quantities of something, the counting of numbers of things, or the counting of the numbers of survey responses this way and survey responses that way. But It's specifically quantitative. It's about counting. Now, this is by no means a perfect way of explaining the two types of research, but it did help me get a handle on it and kept me from embarrassing myself like I did in some of those earlier conversations when I would mix up the two, talking to experts, and would just remind me and everyone in the room that I was not of their number yet. Now, because these two approaches, quantitative and qualitative, are very different, and they're often practiced by people with different personality orientations. Like I said, I'm much more orientated toward qualitative. I'd much rather sit down and have a 2-hour-long conversation to explore an idea with somebody than I would have someone fill out a survey. But because of that, and because often researchers specialize in one or the other, it's easy to get caught in an either or kind of dichotomy. That we decide, well, we need to either do qualitative or quantitative. But we shouldn't let this division or dichotomy limit us in mission research. For the past 30, and that used to be the case in all social sciences research, but in the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a revolution in the social science research world. And increasingly, we talk about mixed methods research. That is, bringing both methods together to get both the best of both on the table, to bear their own light on research questions. So very simply, of course, mixed methods research is combining qualitative and quantitative. So you do a survey and you conduct interviews that are focused on the same research question or questions. But to maximize the value that mixed methods has to offer, it's important to consider how are you mixing them exactly. There are several different ways to mix these methods together. And it's important to think about before you conduct research on how you're going to bring them together, because each one of the different ways has different strengths, different weaknesses, different best case scenarios where they're involved best, and that kind of thing. So today I want us to look at the 3 most common ways that methods are mixed, okay? The 3 most common are concurrent, explanatory sequential, and exploratory sequential. Now, I would venture just a guess that probably 90% of all mixed methods research is done through one of these 3 methods. These 3, either concurrent, explanatory sequential, or exploratory sequential. Now, the first one, concurrent, is the most common by far of the 3, and so we're going to look at that one first. Concurrent design, or sometimes it's called parallel design in some of the literature you'll see, is just what the name implies. Both the qualitative and quantitative modules of the research are conducted at the same time. Both the survey instrument and interview protocols are designed together at the beginning. Both are used to conduct data about at the same time, and you can give priority to either one or the other. They're both analyzed at the same time. The data from each strand is analyzed independently, and then the mixing goes on when you write up your final report. Each shines its own light on the research question or questions that you have, that different perspective it brings on it. The intent of this design is to bring together the strengths of both qualitative and quantitative in a simple, straightforward approach. To visually demonstrate this, it looks just very simple. You plan the interview questions and design surveys at the same time. You conduct your data gathering at the same time. You analyze them at the same time. You interpret them. And then finally, hopefully you can see all of the.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And then finally, you write them up together. You bring both together in the write-up. For example, your research might have to do with, say, better understanding the needs of local pastors in 100 indigenous churches that your organization is planted in West Africa. So you decide to have each of them fill out a 30-question survey. And at the same time, you're going to go around and conduct some hour-long interviews with 10 or 15 of them. After that data is collected, you analyze it, you interpret the results, and then your final report contains both statistical. What happened to my, somehow I lost myself there. Sorry about that.
Mm-hmm.
Then your final report contains both statistical information as well as textured information from the interviews, often in the form of interview quotes that give some depth of understanding to certain things that they said. This is what most people think about when they think about mixed methods, the concurrent design here. Some of the strengths of the concurrent design are that the design is fairly intuitive. It's easy to explain to stakeholders and other people in your organization what you're going to do because it just lays out very neatly together. Secondly, it's efficient. A researcher can collect the data in a very limited time frame. They can say make one trip to the field, get the survey passed out, as well as interviewing people along the way on that trip. And so it's a very compact, efficient design. Also, it's efficient. It's very helpful if you have a team with a qualitative and quantitative researcher working both, that they can work independently of each other, each one in their specialty, and at the end they bring their findings together in the final report. But there are also weaknesses to the concurrent design. First of all, you are faced with the problem of which side gets the most weight. Does the qualitative or quantitative, which one are you going to lean on most? And you almost always will. And so, but if they're run together, it's kind of hard sometimes to decide that. You have another problem. What if the findings from the two modules don't really line up well? What if the qualitative kind of gives you certain kinds of information and the quantitative doesn't really back that up? They kind of diverge. What are you going to do with that? That's really hard to merge in a final report. Also, it can be very challenging to merge the findings in a meaningful way in the final report. But from my perspective, the greatest weakness of the concurrent design is it doesn't really take maximum advantage of the strengths of both qualitative and quantitative that they bring to research. Each one is kind of they're just muddled along together. When I read research reports that are written via the concurrent design, they often have the feeling of being a hodgepodge, that the research question is the only thing that holds it together, and the other two are just kind of running competitively with each other. Sometimes one or the other feels like it's kind of bolted onto the side as almost an extra rather than being fully, there's just not a sense of full integration. And of course, some of this has to do with the way we write things up, but I think the design itself makes it more difficult to have integration of findings because they're done separately and then just merged at the end. Now let's explore the other two types of mixed methods research that are a little less common. Well, there we go. The next one would be, wow, my video keeps turning off. I don't know why. Okay, the first one we'll look at is explanatory sequential. This design and the next one use qualitative and quantitative modules in sequence. That's why the term sequential, obviously. In this case, the quantitative element is the first phase. And like other forms of quantitative research, a survey is designed, data is collected, and then analyzed using various kinds of statistical strategies. But after you develop your quantitative findings, then you switch over to mixed methods thinking for the second phase. Now you take those findings from the surveys and you use them to structure interviews to seek more textured explanations for those quantitative findings. So again, visually, it looks something like this. You design your surveys, you collect responses, you analyze, then you design interview questions that probe the survey results or probe some of the survey results. And you conduct your interviews, you analyze, but then together you interpret those results and write your findings. This is where the key integration takes place, is when you're interpreting them, because one is contributing to the other. They're definitely very connected, not just at the research question level, but even at the findings level, because the findings from one are influencing the findings from the other. So going back to our earlier example of research, say on the needs of indigenous pastors in West Africa, in this explanatory sequential model, after you've surveyed, say, these 100 pastors, then you design interviews specifically to explore those findings. So say, for example, that in your survey, you found that the churches are 75% women under the age of 30. That would be really interesting to figure out, why is there one demographic that's dominating the churches in this region? And so you would use the interviews to ask pastors about that. You could also use it to explore anomalies. While most of the churches look that way, you find that there's a handful, 2 or 3 churches that actually are much more demographically balanced. And so you use the interviews to go back and say, now, why is it? Why, everyone else seems to be having this kind of demographic in their churches, but Pastor, yours is, you have many more older people and many more men in your church. Could we talk about maybe why that is? You explore the findings very specifically. So some of the strengths of the exploratory sequential design are it appeals to quantitative researchers because of the strong quantitative orientation of it. If you're a quantitative researcher, or if your team or your organization is led more in a quantitative direction, this will appeal to them because it feels like it's putting weight in the quantitative, which a lot of people feels more substantial or more concrete. The two-phase structure makes it easy to conduct. You're not trying to do 2 things at one time. You're only doing 1 at a time. And of course, the biggest strength is it adds a depth of nuance that's impossible to have in a quantitative, because you're exploring findings from the quantitative. Survey results you dig in depth, and you actually have people's real answers, their real statements about things that connect to the findings from the quantitative. But there's also weaknesses to this design. It requires a much longer timeline to conduct, because you've got to conduct one, analyze, build the second phase, and then conduct that, and then interpret them. So it makes the whole thing a lot longer. Secondly, there's also the fact that you can only qualitatively explore a limited number of things that turn up in the quantitative. You're just not going to have time in interviews to explore every single finding that comes up, and you're going to have to think carefully through which ones you want to explore. Now, personally, I find the explanatory sequential design to be a very satisfying approach to mixed methods research. Often survey results give us tantalizing glimpses of a phenomenon in the field, and you want to know more. Well, this way you can explore them and chase after things to get concrete examples of those things that just are kind of glimpsed at through your survey results. As I said earlier, you can use them to chase outliers, things that not major findings, but things that are on the edges of your research. And like, well, these 3 were different, or this handful of people here were very different. Why were they different from the rest? I love chasing outliers. I think they give us often insights that the majority findings don't. The explanatory sequential design interviews allows many opportunities for exploring and taking research further. And that's one of the reasons I think it's a great form of mixed methods. Now we want to look at the last of these 3, and that's exploratory sequential design. Like the one before, it's also a sequential design. But in this case, the qualitative comes first and is usually the primary thrust of the research. The researcher starts with a set of open-ended interviews to explore a topic. The less I know about the topic, the more I'm drawn to this model. I want to dig around and hear what people have to say and hear their stories, their narratives, to start gathering an understanding about an unknown topic. It allows us to explore it with wide-ranging interviews. There's so much that we don't know that we can't even ask questions about it. But if we let people range around in interviews, we often will find those things that we didn't even know to ask about. After interviews,
entrevistando as pessoas.
I'm sorry.
Might have been translator breaking through.
Oh, okay. The translation is bleeding over. All right, I'll keep going. In this case, after the interviews are all conducted, transcribed, and analyzed, we start looking and we pick out themes that are important, or we develop theories about how the interviews explain and address our research question. Then we move over into the quantitative and design surveys that will take and actually look and see how does that spread across our population. Because like most qualitative research, it's drawn from a limited pool of interview participants. Without adding the quantitative module, we're really not sure if those ideas are true across the larger population. We've interviewed 15 pastors, but there's 100 of them that are all in that same study pool. We don't know if the ideas that we gleaned from 15 of them really apply across the larger pool. And that's where moving into the second phase, the quantitative, does it for us. Technically, we use the survey to see if we can generalize the qualitative findings to a larger population. So again, a visualization. We plan the interview questions, we conduct interviews, we analyze, then we do survey questions that connect with those interview findings, collect the responses, analyze, and then interpret them and write them in synthesis together. Let's again imagine our scenario of the research with 100 local pastors in West Africa. You've been receiving the reports of baptisms, attendance, and so forth, but you really don't know about their day-to-day ministry. So you interview 15 or 20 of them to talk about their ministry and just talk about their lives. And then from these interviews, you go back and you design surveys to find out more about how you might help them. And specifically see, okay, from these 15 or 20 we interviewed, these seem to be some key issues that we could help them grow and develop their ministries, but does that apply widely? And you then see if you can generalize by doing the surveys. The strengths are that it has clearly distinct phases and makes management easier. The addition of a quantitative phase can, after the end of the qualitative is over, can help people who are a little skeptical of qualitative research buy into it and see that it has a little more concrete statistical and certainly more concrete with statistical analysis. And the survey can be written very tightly because you're only exploring some key ideas. You're not trying to range widely. Again, though, there are also weaknesses. It takes longer for completion, and it sometimes is difficult to obtain the participation of a wide population of people to get the survey spread out. You don't want to interview 15 and then only have surveys of 20. It just doesn't work. The exploratory sequential design is a delightful mix of both worlds. It's my personal favorite, but that's just because I'm a qualitative researcher, so I focus on that. I hope I've convinced you that there's value in doing mixed methods research. It's not that one approach is best. There's times when some just simply works in a way better than others, and sometimes you can mix them together. You can't always do that. When I did my doctoral research, I did it with Muslim background believers in Central Asia, and I interviewed 40 of them, but there was no way I was going to be able to survey another 100 or so. There just wasn't, number one, the concept of doing surveys was something they weren't familiar with. And number two, it was going to feel far too exposed for them. And so there wasn't any way to do mixed methods. But many times we can do mixed methods, and the two different approaches bring light to a subject in a way that one approach or the other does not. And they give us, often it will give us the richest, clearest answers to the mission research questions that we're dealing with. But I think one of the things that keeps us from doing it is that we don't have the skill set for it. You know, I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm not real good with quantitative. I can do basic quantitative analysis in Excel, but sophisticated regression analysis and things like that, I just don't do. That's why we need to work together with each other. I always do mixed methods. Whenever I'm going to do a mixed methods project, I recruit a quantitative scientist to come and join me and let them do the hard work of the regression analysis, and I get the fun of interpreting the analysis that they've done. So that it's a good place for us as a community to draw on each other's strengths and abilities to help us do mixed methods research. And before I finish, I want to just quickly point out a book that is very helpful. I found it's called Designing and Conducting Mixed Methods Research by Cresswell and Clark. It's full of both theory and practical design for not only the three methods that I visited, but also several other less common methods. It's very, very helpful if you're going to do mixed methods research for the first time, or even not just the first time. I review this often, so I would highly recommend this as a book if you're interested in mixed methods research. Now with that, I think we're going to go to Q&A, and I will stop my screen share, and I also will put my email in the chat box in case anyone would like to contact me and pick up on any of this. But let's go to Q&A now.
Great, thank you, Daniel. Nice, clear visuals helping us understand that.